In polling conducted across the past 2 decades, the share of adults in the United States who say they believe at least one major conspiracy theory ranges from 40 to 60%, depending on the survey and the theory. In other countries, the numbers are comparable. Some of what is described as a conspiracy theory has, on examination, been documented and confirmed. Some has been documented and refuted. Most sits in a middle ground, partially supported, partially refuted, and contested by serious people on both sides. What follows is a guided descent through the catalog of conspiracy claims. The claims at the surface you have heard. The claims at the bottom you have probably not. Throughout, the question is not what you choose to believe. It is what the underlying record actually shows. Tier 1, the mainstream. Conspiracy claims that have been discussed in major outlets, polled in national surveys, and are recognized terms in general culture. The Kennedy assassination single shooter question. On the 22nd of November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas. The official 1964 conclusion of the Warren Commission was that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded, based on acoustic evidence that has since been disputed, that the assassination was probably the result of a conspiracy involving at least 2 shooters, while declining to identify any second shooter or group. Multiple subsequent reviews have re-examined the physical, ballistic, and witness evidence. The 2023 article in the Washington Post by Paul Landis, a former Secret Service agent present in Dallas, presented a contemporaneous observation about a bullet at the scene that, if accepted, would complicate the standard single bullet trajectory model. The implications for the original conclusion are debated. The case files at the National Archives, including the JFK assassination records collection, contain documents whose release dates have been extended multiple times. The question of whether Oswald acted alone is, in polling of the American public, the most widely held conspiracy belief in modern history. The moon landing hoax claim. Between 1969 and 1972, NASA conducted 6 crewed lunar landings as part of the Apollo program. The claim that the landings were fabricated, typically attributed to political pressure in the Cold War context, has been a persistent fringe belief for decades. The evidence for the landings includes retroflectors placed on the lunar surface by Apollo 11, 14, and 15, which can be ranged from Earth-based observatories using laser pulses, and which produce return times consistent with the placement and current orbital position of the moon. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, in 2009 and subsequent years, photographed all 6 Apollo landing sites with resolution sufficient to image the lander descent stages, rover tracks, and discarded equipment. The 842 pounds of lunar samples returned by Apollo astronauts have been analyzed in laboratories worldwide, including in countries that were Cold War adversaries of the United States. The samples are isotopically distinct from terrestrial rocks in ways consistent with lunar origins. The moon landing hoax claim, despite this evidence, retains a small but persistent base of support in polling. The mainstream scientific consensus is that the landings occurred. The claim is included here not because it is contested in the scientific record, but because it is contested in the public record. The Roswell incident. In July 1947, a rancher near Roswell, New Mexico, recovered debris from his property. The local Air Force base issued a press release announcing the recovery of a flying disc. The release was retracted within hours and replaced with a statement attributing the debris to a weather balloon. The discrepancy between the 2 statements became the foundation of subsequent claims. In 1994, the United States Air Force released a report identifying the actual source of the debris as Project Mogul, a classified high-altitude balloon array intended to detect Soviet nuclear tests through atmospheric pressure waves. In 1997, a follow-up Air Force report addressed claims that bodies had been recovered, attributing those claims to misremembered combinations of distinct events, including the recovery of crash, test dummies from later programs, and aviation accidents, conflated by witnesses recalling decades later. The Project Mogul explanation accounts for the physical debris characteristics described by contemporary witnesses. The bodies recovered claim by Air Force analysis is a memory artifact. The Roswell incident remains the foundational case of modern American UFO discourse, despite the official explanations. The 11th of September inside, job claims. On the 11th of September 2001, 4 coordinated attacks by Al-Qaeda operatives killed 2,977 people in the United States. The National Institute of Standards and Technology subsequently published multi-year engineering investigations of the structural failures at the World Trade Center, including the collapse of Building 7, a 47-story tower that fell hours after the main towers. A range of claims have argued that the collapses were inconsistent with damage from the aircraft impacts and resulting fires, and that controlled demolition or other mechanisms must have been involved. NIST investigations, including the Building 7 report finalized in 2008, identified the mechanisms as thermal expansion of structural elements following sustained fires, leading to the failure of a critical column and progressive collapse. The engineering community has, in the substantial majority, accepted the NIST conclusions. A minority of engineers organized through groups, including architects and engineers for 9/11's truth, have continued to dispute the mechanism. The 9/11's Commission's final report on the broader attack, published in 2004, included specific criticisms of intelligence failures and recommendations that have largely been implemented. The 11th of September attacks are in mainstream historical record attributed to Al-Qaeda. The inside job claims are a persistent minority position. The shadow government claims. A persistent strand of conspiracy thought holds that significant policy decisions in major democracies are made not by elected officials but by long-standing networks of influence, variously described as the deep state, the shadow government, the establishment, or specific named institutions such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, or the Bohemian Club. Some of these institutions exist and meet privately. The Bilderberg Group, for example, has held annual private meetings since 1954, attended by figures from government, business, and media, with attendee lists publicly released. The Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations are well-documented policy organizations. Their existence is not in dispute. The question of whether their meetings produce coordinated policy decisions that bypass formal democratic processes is in dispute. Mainstream political science treats these institutions as forums for elite networking and policy discussion rather than as governing bodies. Critical scholarship by writers including C. Wright Mills and others has analyzed elite network influence on policy without endorsing the strongest versions of shadow government claims. The institutions are real. The scope and mechanism of their influence is the subject of legitimate scholarly debate and of unfalsifiable popular claim. At Tier 1, the mainstream conspiracy claims are familiar terms in the general culture. Most have received institutional examination. The conclusions, in many cases, leave residual disputes. Tier 2, the confirmed, claims that were once dismissed as conspiracy theory and that subsequent documentation has confirmed in their essential elements. Project M. Cultra. From the 1952 through 1973, the Central Intelligence Agency conducted a series of programs investigating mind control techniques, including the administration of LSD and other psychoactive substances, to subjects who in many cases were not informed. The programs were classified at multiple levels. Claims about their existence circulated for years before being treated as conspiracy theory. In 1975, the Church Committee in the United States Senate and the Rockefeller Commission examined CIA activities. McCultra was confirmed. In 1977, declassified documents were released and reviewed in additional Senate hearings. The program had included subprojects across more than 40 universities, hospitals, prisons, and research facilities. The CIA director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most McCultra files in 1973. Approximately 20,000 pages of accounting records survived because they had been filed separately. McCultra is the canonical confirmed example of a major covert program once treated as conspiracy fiction. The documentation is now public. The program's existence, scope, and use of non-consenting subjects are matters of historical record. Operation Northwoods. In 1962, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff produced a document proposing operations under which the United States could create the pretext for military action against Cuba. The operations included staged incidents, attacks attributed to Cuba on American military or civilian targets, that would, in fact, have been carried out by American forces. The document was submitted to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who rejected it. The proposal was not implemented. The Northwoods document was declassified in 1997. Its existence is uncontested. The document is in the public archive. The content includes specific scenarios for staged attacks. The relevance to broader conspiracy claims, Operation Northwoods is direct documentary evidence that in at least one major instance, senior military officials seriously proposed false flag operations against American targets. The proposal was rejected, but the proposal existed. In contemporary conspiracy discourse, Operation Northwoods is frequently cited as evidence of capability and intent. The document does not prove that any other specific event was a false flag operation. It does establish that the conceptual framework for such operations existed at the highest levels of American defense planning. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, From 1932 to 1972, the United States Public Health Service conducted a study in Macon County, Alabama, of the natural progression of untreated syphilis in 399 black men, most of them sharecroppers. The men were not informed they had syphilis. They were told they had bad blood. When penicillin became the standard of care for syphilis in the late 1942, the study subjects were not treated. The study continued for an additional 25 years after effective treatment was available. The study was exposed by Gene Heller of the Associated Press in 1972. A Senate investigation followed. The study was terminated. In 1997, President Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. The legal settlement provided lifetime medical care for surviving participants and their family members. The Tuskegee study is the canonical example in American history of a long-running government conducted research program that withheld effective treatment from subjects without informed consent. It is in part responsible for the contemporary structure of bioethics oversight, including the common rule and the requirements of institutional review boards. COINTELPRO. From 1956 to 1971, the Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted a series of covert programs targeting domestic political organizations, including the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Panther Party, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the American Indian Movement, and a range of student and anti-war groups. The programs, collectively called COINTELPRO, included surveillance, infiltration, dissemination of disinformation, and active efforts to disrupt and discredit the targeted organizations. COINTELPRO was exposed in 1971 when activists broke into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and removed documents that they released to journalists. The exposure led to the Church Committee investigations. The program was officially discontinued in 1971, subsequent litigation, including Hampton v. Hanrahan in connection with the 1969 killing of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, established that FBI infiltration and information sharing had directly contributed to specific outcomes. COINTELPRO is documented in tens of thousands of declassified FBI files. The program's existence, methods, and consequences are matters of historical and judicial record. The Snowden Disclosures. In 2013, Edward Snowden, a contractor for the National Security Agency, released to journalists a body of classified documents describing the scope of NSA surveillance programs. The disclosures included the existence of PRISM, a program collecting communications data from major American technology companies, Xkeyscore, an analysis system for collected internet data, and bulk collection of telephone metadata from American carriers under Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act. The metadata collection program had been the subject of claims by privacy advocates for years before the disclosures. Those claims had been characterized as overstated or as conspiracy theory by some government and media voices. The Snowden documents confirmed the program's existence, scope, and operation. The USA Freedom Act of 2015 modified the bulk metadata program in response. Multiple court rulings, including in the Second Circuit, found the program as conducted to have exceeded statutory authority. Snowden himself remains under federal indictment. His disclosures, however, have been verified in their material elements by official acknowledgement and subsequent legislative and judicial action. The programs existed substantially as described. The conspiracy theory version, in this case, was correct. At Tier 2, the confirmed cases established that some claims dismissed as conspiracy theory have later been validated by primary documentation. The pattern argues for empirical evaluation case by case, rather than blanket dismissal or blanket acceptance. Tier 3, the contested. Claims with substantial documentation supporting their basic factual structure, but with disputed interpretation, scope, or implication. The Iran-Contra affair. During the second Reagan administration, members of the National Security Council and other officials arranged sales of weapons to Iran in apparent contravention of an arms embargo, and used the proceeds to fund the Nicaraguan Contras at a time when Congress had prohibited such funding through the Bolin Amendments. The arrangements were exposed in November 1986. The Tower Commission and the Joint Congressional Investigation produced extensive findings. Several officials were criminally charged, including Oliver North, John Poindexter, and Caspar Weinberger. Convictions were obtained at trial. Several were reversed on appeal on grounds related to the use of immunized testimony. President Reagan acknowledged that the arrangements had occurred while disputing the characterization that he had directed them. President George H.W. Bush, his successor, issued pardons to several of the defendants in late 1992. The factual structure of Iran-Contra is established. The contested elements, the extent of presidential awareness and direction, the relationships between the operations, and broader narcotics trafficking allegations subsequently raised by the journalist Gary Webb. and the question of accountability that the pardons effectively foreclosed. The affair is in current historical writing a confirmed instance of executive branch operations conducted in tension with congressional authority. The CIA, cocaine claims. In a 1996 series for the San Jose Mercury News titled Dark Alliance, journalist Gary Webb reported that cocaine sales by Nicaraguan Contra aligned figures had been a significant source of crack cocaine entering Los Angeles in the 1980 seconds, and that the relevant U.S. agencies had at minimum tolerated the trafficking in service of Contra fundraising. The series received initial attention and significant subsequent criticism from other major outlets. In 1998, the CIA's Inspector General Frederick Hitz released 2 reports in response to the controversy. The first report acknowledged that the CIA had been aware of allegations of drug trafficking involving Contra, aligned figures, and had not, in all instances, reported such allegations to law enforcement. The 1995 cessation of the agency's obligation to report such allegations to the Department of Justice under a 1982 Memorandum of Understanding removed one mechanism that would have ensured action. The report did not establish a deliberate CIA program to import cane into American cities. It did establish that the agency's posture toward Contra aligned drug trafficking had been considerably more permissive than the agency had previously acknowledged. Gary Webb's reporting was, at the time of publication, treated as overstated. The Inspector General's findings vindicated significant portions of his reporting while leaving the strongest framing, a deliberate program, unconfirmed. Webb died in 2004. The fuller historical assessment of his work has been more favorable than the contemporary reaction. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. On the 2nd of August and the 4th of August 1964, the United States Navy reported attacks on its destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, off North Vietnam. The reported attacks were the immediate justification for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the broader American military escalation in Vietnam. The 2nd of August attack appears by all subsequent reviews to have occurred. The 4th of August attack on the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy was reported in real time as an engagement against multiple enemy vessels. In 2005, the National Security Agency declassified an internal historical study by Robert Hanyok, concluding that the 4th of August incident had not occurred. The signals intelligence intercepts referenced at the time had been from the 2nd of August. They had been misattributed to the 4th of August in the rush of events. The crews of the American destroyers had, in low visibility conditions, mistaken their own radar artifacts and possibly false sonar returns for enemy contacts. The reported engagement of the 4th of August was, in the NSA's internal historical conclusion, a false report, not a deliberate fabrication, but a mistake. The Vietnam War escalated on the basis of an event that had not occurred. The NSA's release acknowledges this. The historical record now contains both the original reports and the later correction. The implications for how immediate intelligence is used in major decisions are part of subsequent reform efforts. The Manhattan Project secrecy and the Demon Core incidents. The Manhattan Project was, by design, one of the most heavily compartmented programs in American history. Roughly 130,000 people worked on it. The vast majority did not know the program's purpose. After the war, classified incidents at Los Alamos, including the criticality accidents involving the Demon Core, a subcritical plutonium sphere, were not disclosed to the public for decades. The criticality accidents killed 2 researchers, Harry Daghlian in 1945 and Louis Slotin in 1946. The details of the accidents, the involvement of the same plutonium mass, and the broader history of post-war nuclear handling incidents at American facilities were known internally and were partially declassified across the following decades. The fuller catalog, including the Idaho Cell 1 reactor accident of 1961, and a range of underreported incidents at Hanford and Rocky Flats, was assembled by independent researchers by the Department of Energy's own Openness Initiative, beginning in 1993, and by historians working from declassified materials. The pattern across the nuclear weapons program is one of substantial historical secrecy, followed by a partial declassification, followed by reconstruction of a fuller record. The current record of nuclear handling incidents is more complete than the record was at any time during the Cold War. The reconstruction is not finished. The Operation Paperclip recruitment. After World War II, the United States recruited German scientists and engineers, many of whom had been members of the Nazi Party, into American military and aerospace research. The recruitment, known as Operation Paperclip, brought approximately 1,600 individuals to the United States. Among them were Wernher von Braun, who led the V. II program in Germany and subsequently led the Saturn V program at NASA, and Arthur Rudolph, who managed the V2 production facility that used concentrated camp labor and later worked at NASA on the Saturn V. The recruitment program was officially acknowledged after the war, but the full extent of the Nazi affiliations and wartime conduct of the recruited personnel was not consistently disclosed. The 1979 Office of Special Investigations within the Justice Department reviewed the records of several paperclip recruits. Some, including Arthur Rudolph, were subsequently denaturalized and removed from the United States. Others died before review or had their files closed. Operation Paperclip is the documented confluence of post-war geopolitical pragmatism and serious questions of accountability for war-era conduct. The program is publicly documented. The specifics of individual cases continue to be researched in the National Archives and in collaborating archives in Germany. At Tier 3, the contested cases are documented in their basic outline. The interpretation, scope, and implication remain matters of substantive analysis. Tier 4, the Unresolved, claims where the available evidence is partial, where significant questions persist, and where the mainstream position itself acknowledges uncertainty. The Havana Syndrome reports. Beginning in late 2016, American and Canadian diplomatic personnel in Havana, Cuba reported a range of neurological symptoms including tinnitus, vertigo, cognitive difficulties, and persistent headaches. The reports expanded over subsequent years to include personnel in China, Russia, Austria, and several other locations. The phenomenon was variously called the Havana Syndrome, anomalous health incidents, or directed energy attacks. A 2020 study by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine concluded that directed energy attacks, specifically pulsed radio frequency exposure, were the most plausible explanation among those considered. A 2023 intelligence community assessment concluded, with varying degrees of confidence across agencies, that a foreign adversary was unlikely to be responsible for most of the reported cases. The assessment did not rule out external causation in all cases. A National Institutes of Health study published in 2024 found no consistent brain, imaging, or blood biomarker differences between affected personnel and controls. The symptoms reported by personnel are real and have been clinically documented. The cause, whether external directed energy weapons, environmental exposures, mass psychogenic phenomena, or some combination, has not been definitively determined. Multiple federal investigations are ongoing. The Havana Syndrome is a current example of a phenomenon where the surface conspiracy framing, foreign attacks on American officials, is treated as one of several open hypotheses by the US government itself. The UAP question. In 2020 and subsequent years, the United States government formally acknowledged the existence of an investigative office dedicated to unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP, and released gun camera footage from Navy aircraft, showing objects whose flight characteristics did not match identified aircraft. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence has published preliminary assessments. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, established in 2022, has continued the work. Of the cases reviewed, the vast majority have been or are expected to be resolved as identified objects: balloons, drones, satellites, atmospheric phenomena. A residual subset has not been resolved. In 2023, former Air Force intelligence officer David Grush testified to Congress that the United States possessed material from non-human origin craft. The testimony was presented under oath. The supporting evidence was, in Grush's account, classified and not presented in open hearing. The agencies named by Grush denied his characterizations. The investigations are continuing. The unresolved residual is small but non-zero. The mainstream institutional position is open inquiry without affirmation of extraordinary claims. The unresolved residual remains, by definition, unresolved. The Jeffrey Epstein case. Jeffrey Epstein, a financier with extensive social and political connections, was charged in 2019 with sex trafficking offenses. He had previously pleaded guilty in 2008 to state-level charges under a federal non-prosecution agreement that has been the subject of subsequent legal and ethical criticism. In August 2019, Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. The death was ruled suicide. The circumstances of the death have been the subject of multiple reviews and continuing dispute. The cellmate had been removed shortly before. The cameras in the area malfunctioned during the relevant time window. The guards on duty falsified records and were subsequently charged. The medical examiner ruled suicide. An outside review by Michael Baden, retained by the Epstein estate, concluded the injuries were more consistent with homicidal strangulation. The Department of Justice Inspector General's report concluded that the suicide ruling was supported. while acknowledging the institutional failures at the facility. The investigation of Epstein's broader network continued after his death. Some associates have been prosecuted, many records remain sealed under various legal mechanisms. The disposition of the financial structures and the identification of all individuals involved in Epstein's activities has not been fully resolved in the public record. The anthrax letters investigation. In the weeks following the 11th of September 2001 attacks, letters containing weaponized anthrax spores were sent to several news organizations and 2 United States senators. 5 people died, 17 were sickened. The FBI investigation, designated Amrithrax, lasted 7 years. In 2008, the FBI publicly identified scientist Bruce Ivins, a researcher at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, as the sole perpetrator. Ivins had died by suicide weeks before the public announcement. The conclusion that Ivins acted alone has been contested by several review bodies. A 2011 review by the National Academy of Sciences concluded that the FBI's scientific evidence, principally the genetic match between letters and a flask of anthrax in Ivins' custody, did not in itself establish that Ivins had produced and mailed the letters. Several of Ivins' colleagues, including some who had been initial suspects, have continued to dispute the FBI conclusion publicly. The FBI has not modified its formal conclusion. The independent reviews have flagged but not displaced that conclusion. The Amrithrax investigation is officially closed. The genuine scientific debate over whether the right perpetrator was identified has not been closed. The Wuhan origin question. The COVID-19 pandemic, first identified in late 2019 in Wuhan, China, has been the subject of competing hypotheses regarding its origin. The 2 principal hypotheses are zoonotic spillover from an animal reservoir through a wildlife market, and an accidental laboratory release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which conducted research on related coronaviruses. The published scientific literature has been substantially divided. Multiple studies have argued for the natural origin hypothesis, including investigations of the Huanan seafood wholesale market and analyses of the early case cluster's multiple intelligence. Community assessments have been split. As of recent unclassified summaries, the FBI and the Department of Energy assess with low or moderate confidence that a laboratory-related incident is the most likely origin. Other agencies assess that natural origin is more likely. Some agencies have remained undecided. The Chinese government has not released the full data that might definitively resolve the question. The question of the origin of COVID-19 is, at the time of this script's composition, formally open. Both hypotheses remain consistent with significant portions of the available evidence. The investigation is continuing with significant impediments to data access. The lab leak framing, dismissed in some quarters of public discourse in 2020, is now treated by several U.S. government agencies as a leading hypothesis. At Tier 4, the unresolved cases have institutional acknowledgement of uncertainty. The investigations continue. The findings, when they come, will modify the public record. Tier 5, the Marginal, claims that have circulated for years or decades and have not been confirmed by mainstream investigation, but which have not been definitively refuted in a way that closes the public discussion. The Bohemian Grove. The Bohemian Club, founded in 1872, maintains a summer encampment at Bohemian Grove in Northern California. The annual gathering, attended by approximately 2,000 members and guests, has included multiple American presidents, cabinet officials, business leaders, and prominent artists. The gathering is private, photography is restricted. The opening ceremony, called the Cremation of Care, involves robed figures and a mock sacrifice ritual at a large stone owl effigy. The Cremation of Care was filmed surreptitiously by journalist Alex Jones in 2000 and by independent journalists at other times. The ritual is theatrical, with a written script. It is, by accounts of attendees, a satirical or dramatic exercise rather than a serious religious observance. The fact of the ritual is established. The interpretation, whether it is harmless theatrical tradition or evidence of deeper occult practice, is in active dispute among observers. The Bohemian Club is documented. The membership lists, when available, include verifiable major figures. The summer gathering occurs annually. The substantive question of whether business and policy decisions are made at the gathering is contested. Attendees uniformly deny it. The contested portion of the claim is, in current scholarship, unconfirmed. The Federal Reserve creation claims the Federal Reserve System was established by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The drafting of the legislation involved a meeting at Jekyll Island, Georgia, in November 1910, attended by Senator Nelson Aldrich. Several major bankers, including Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb and Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank of New York, and several Treasury officials. The meeting was held under conditions of substantial secrecy. The attendees subsequently described the meeting in memoirs and interviews. The fact of the Jekyll Island meeting is documented. The bankers' role in shaping the draft legislation is documented. The interpretation of this fact has produced a range of claims. The strongest claims hold that the Federal Reserve is privately owned by a small group of families who collect the profits of currency issuance from the United States. The mainstream economic interpretation holds that the Federal Reserve is a hybrid institution, a central bank with significant private sector input but with policy direction by a public board of governors and with profits after operating expenses remitted to the Treasury. The Federal Reserve does remit substantial annual profits to the United States Treasury, in some years exceeding $100 billion. The private ownership claim in its strongest form is not supported by the legal and financial structure of the institution. The original closed door drafting at Jekyll Island is, however, a real and documented part of the institution's history, the Smedley-Butler business plot. In 1934, Major General Smedley Butler, a highly decorated United States Marine, testified to the House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities that a group of business interests had approached him with a plan to organize a force of veterans to march on Washington and pressure President Franklin Roosevelt to resign or surrender significant authority. The investigation was led by Representatives John McCormack and Samuel Dickstein. The committee's report, issued in 1935, concluded that Butler's allegations were credible in their general outline. No prosecutions followed. The committee did not, in the report or in subsequent action, pursue the named alleged plotters. The press treatment of the matter at the time was generally dismissive. The historical reassessment by historians, including Jules Archer, has been more receptive to Butler's account. The Butler testimony is in the congressional record. The committee's conclusion that the allegations had substance is in the record. The reason for the absence of any prosecution, and the assessment of how far the plot had actually advanced, are matters of continuing historical debate. The episode is one of the more substantively documented allegations of a planned coup in 20th century American history. It is also one of the least widely discussed: the black helicopter sightings. Beginning in the 1990 seconds, reports of unmarked black helicopters operating over various American locations entered the conspiracy discourse vocabulary. The helicopters were, in the typical claim, associated with federal law, enforcement operations, environmental surveillance, or military exercises. The factual portion of the claim, federal law enforcement and military helicopters do operate over American territory, in some cases without external markings. Drug Enforcement Administration helicopters, Border Patrol aircraft, Department of Energy nuclear emergency search, team aircraft, and military exercises by various commands have all been documented to use unmarked rotary wing assets. The Department of Energy maintains a nuclear emergency aerial measuring system that includes a fleet of unmarked aircraft. The expansion of the claim that the helicopters are part of a foreign or extra-governmental occupation of American airspace or are associated with Federal Emergency Management Agency detention plans has not been supported by primary documentation. The aircraft are real. The most common observed instances are accounted for by documented government programs. The extended narrative is in current evidence unsupported. The MK Delta and other McUltra branches. Project McUltra had multiple subprojects, and the full extent of related programs has been the subject of continuing reconstruction. Project MK Delta, MK Naomi, MK Search, Project Bluebird, and Project Artichoke were related CIA mind control and behavior modification efforts. The destruction of records in 1973 means that the full scope of these programs may never be reconstructed. What is known, the programs involve testing on military personnel, federal prisoners, hospital patients, and in some cases members of the general public exposed without their knowledge. The Frank Olson case, a U.S. Army biological warfare scientist who fell or jumped from a hotel window in 1953 after being administered LSD without his knowledge, has been the subject of multiple investigations, none of which has fully resolved the circumstances of his death. The family settled with the U.S. government in 1976. Subsequent investigations have included exhumation. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office reopened the case as a homicide investigation in 1996. The case has not been definitively closed. The remaining documentation of McUltra-related programs covers only a fraction of the total. The further details of individual incidents, including the Olson death, are continuing subjects of investigative and historical work. The branches of these programs remain a partial record. The complete record is no longer available. The Phoenix Lights. On the 13th of March, 1997, large numbers of people in Phoenix, Arizona, and across much of the state observed a series of lights in the night sky. The lights appeared in two distinct phases, a V-shaped formation that traversed the state, and a series of stationary lights that hovered over Phoenix. Among the witnesses was then Governor Fife Symington, who initially treated the matter humorously, and later, in 2007, publicly stated that he had personally seen the formation, and that it had been, in his view, a craft of unknown type. The stationary lights over Phoenix were subsequently identified by the Air National Guard as flares dropped during a training exercise at the Barry M. Goldwater Range southwest of Phoenix. This explanation accounts for the timing and location of the stationary lights. The earlier V formation has not been similarly explained. Witnesses including pilots, military personnel, and city residents have given accounts consistent with a large physical object passing over the state at altitude. The Air Force has not officially identified the V formation. The Phoenix lights are unusual in the documentary record because of the credibility of some of the witnesses, including the former governor. The flare explanation accounts for part of the event. The remainder is unresolved. At Tier 5, the marginal claims have partial documentary support without conclusive resolution. They occupy a long-running middle ground. Tier 6, the Esoteric, claims that exist at the edges of the conspiracy literature, discussed in specialist communities, rarely in mainstream press, and generally with weak documentary support. The Montauk Project claims. A body of claims associated with the former U.S. Air Force Camp Hero installation at Montauk, Long Island, holds that secret research into electromagnetic mind, control, time travel, and contact with non-human intelligences was conducted at the facility between the 1960 seconds and 1980 seconds. The claims were promulgated principally by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon in a series of books beginning in 1992. The factual underlay, Camp Hero was a real U.S. Air Force facility. It hosted the Sage Air Defense radar system with a large rotating antenna whose distinctive structure remains visible on the site. The base was decommissioned in 1981. The Montauk Project claims beyond the existence of the base and its radar systems are not supported by primary documentation, declassified records, or independent witnesses with verifiable credentials. The principal originator, Preston Nichols, is the source for most of the specific claims. The Montauk Project claims have entered popular culture through their influence on the Netflix series Stranger Things and through online discussion communities. The basic factual structure of the facility is real. The extraordinary claims about its activities are in the current state of documentation, unsupported. The Philadelphia Experiment. A claim originating in correspondence sent in 1955 and 1956 to UFO researcher Morris Jessup by a person calling himself Carl M. Alan or Carlos Allende holds that the United States Navy conducted experiments in 1943 at the Philadelphia Naval Yard that rendered the USS Eldridge invisible and teleported it briefly to Norfolk, Virginia. The claims include descriptions of dead crew members and crew members embedded in the ship's structure. The U.S. Navy has stated that no such experiment occurred. The USS Eldridge's logs and crew records do not place the ship at the Philadelphia Naval Yard on the dates claimed. The Office of Naval Research has issued a factual statement addressing the claims, concluding that the events as described are inconsistent with the known operational history of the ship and with the physics involved. The Philadelphia Experiment claim has persisted for decades in popular literature and film. The primary source remains the correspondence from Allende. Allende's identity has been investigated. He was a real person with a documented history of unreliable communications. The claim, evaluated against the primary record, is not supported. It is included here as a canonical example of esoteric conspiracy literature with deep cultural penetration and minimal evidentiary basis. The Dulce base claims. A body of claims originating principally in the 1980 seconds, with security guard Philip Schneider and others, holds that an underground joint human extraterrestrial facility exists at Dulce, New Mexico, on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation. The claims include descriptions of military conflicts between human personnel and non-human entities at the facility. The factual underlay, Dulce is a real community. The Jicarilla Apache Reservation surrounds it. The area has, since the 1970 seconds, been the subject of unusual livestock, mutilation reports, some of which were investigated by retired FBI agent Kenneth Rommel. The Rommel report concluded that the mutilations were attributable to natural predation and post-mortem scavenging by birds and small mammals. The Dulce base claims as articulated by Schneider and others go far beyond the documented mutilation phenomena and have not been corroborated by independent investigation. Schneider was a real person. His credentials and the documentation he offered have been challenged. He died in 1996. The Dulce-based claims have generated extensive online discussion and several books. The primary sources have not survived independent scrutiny. The factual basis, a small town in northern New Mexico with documented cases of unusual livestock deaths, has been examined and largely explained by conventional mechanisms. The extraordinary structure of the broader claims is unsupported. The Project Bluebeam claims. A claim associated with the late Canadian journalist Serge Monast holds that a project of major Western governments and the United Nations exists to stage a false religious or extraterrestrial event using advanced holographic technology in order to consolidate global political authority. The claims were articulated in writings by Monast in the early 1992. Monast died in 1996. The original documents do not provide primary sources. The technical capabilities described, atmospheric holographic projection at the scale of entire continents, are not consistent with documented current display technology. The political structure described, an integrated global authority capable of executing the staging, is not consistent with the current political dispersion of state and corporate power. The claims have persisted and reappear in online discussions, particularly around major astronomical events. Project Bluebeam is an example of a conspiracy claim with minimal documentary basis that has nonetheless persisted for over 30 years, and that surfaces in current cultural moments. It is included here to mark the existence of law, running esoteric narratives that may not correspond to any reality, but which sustain discussion communities indefinitely. The Babylon working claims. In 1946, rocket propulsion pioneer Jack Parsons, one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech, conducted a series of magical ceremonies he called the Babylon Working. Parsons was a follower of the occultist Aleister Crowley. The ceremonies, performed with a partner who at the time was L. Ron Hubbard, the future founder of Scientology, were intended to invoke a goddess presence. The factual underlay Parsons was real. His career at JPL, where craters on the moon are named after him, is well documented. His occult practice is documented in his correspondence and in records of the Ordo Templi Orientis, where he was a member. His partnership with Hubbard during the Babylon Working is documented in their contemporary correspondence. Parsons was killed in a 1952 explosion in his home laboratory. The Babylon Working sits at an unusual intersection of documented 20th century history. The founding figures of two major American institutions, JPL and Scientology, jointly engaged in occult practice, and a claim made in some conspiracy literature that the ceremonies opened a portal with subsequent consequences for 20th century events. The factual portion, the ceremonies, the figures involved, the dates, is documented. The metaphysical claim, that the ceremonies had real-world effects beyond their psychological impact on the participants, is not subject to empirical evaluation. At Tier 6, the esoteric claims are sustained more by the durability of their narratives than by their documentary basis. They are, in many cases, the deepest commitments of the conspiracy literature and the most difficult to evaluate by ordinary standards. Tier 7, the bottom. Claims at the deepest stratum of the conspiracy literature, claims that in some cases are metaphysical rather than historical, that propose mechanisms that cannot be tested with available methods, or that exist in such densely interlinked networks of allegation that the original factual referent has been lost. The Archon claims. A body of claims originating principally in the modern reinterpretation of Gnostic texts holds that the apparent material world is administered by non-physical entities called archons, who manipulate human history and consciousness to maintain conditions of suffering and ignorance. The claims appear in writings by John Lash, in the broader New Age literature, and increasingly in online esoteric communities. The Gnostic texts cited as primary sources, including the Nag Hammadi library, recovered in 1945 in Egypt and translated over subsequent decades, do describe a cosmological framework in which non-physical beings are responsible for the construction and ongoing maintenance of the material world. The interpretation of these texts as descriptions of actual entities operating in current history, rather than as ancient theological metaphors, is a modern reinterpretation. The Archon claims are not evaluable by standard historical or scientific methods. They propose mechanisms, non-physical entities, manipulation of consciousness, that fall outside the domain of evidence-based investigation. They are included here to mark the boundary of the conspiracy iceberg, where claims pass from historical assertion to metaphysical commitment. The Gnostic texts are real, the reinterpretation is recent. The empirical status of the claims is not accessible. The simulation hypothesis as conspiracy. The simulation hypothesis, articulated formally by philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003, holds that one of three propositions must be true. Civilizations almost never reach the technological capability to simulate ancestor experiences. Civilizations that reach such capability rarely choose to use it, or we are almost certainly living in such a simulation. The argument is structured as a probabilistic inference rather than as a positive empirical claim. In conspiracy literature, the simulation hypothesis is sometimes treated as a positive claim that we are in fact in a simulation, and that the entities operating the simulation are the ultimate source of the patterns observed at other tiers of the conspiracy iceberg. The mainstream philosophical and physical science discussion of the hypothesis treats it as a meaningful but currently untestable proposition. Several proposed empirical tests, for example, search for evidence of computational granularity in physical constants, have not produced positive results. The simulation hypothesis as conspiracy is included here as an instance where a serious philosophical proposition has been imported into the conspiracy literature with its skeptical framing removed. The original argument is open. The downstream, we are definitely in a simulation. And here are the operator's version is not supported by the form of the original argument, the synchronicity as evidence claims. A position visible in deeper conspiracy discussion holds that the experience of meaningful coincidences, a number, a name, a symbol that appears repeatedly across unrelated contexts, constitutes evidence of an underlying coordinating intelligence. The claim is often connected to interpretations of work by Carl Jung, who introduced the term synchronicity in 1952 to describe what he considered meaningful coincidence outside of ordinary causal explanation. The psychological literature has subsequently treated apparent synchronicity primarily as a result of pattern recognition cognition operating on the high baseline rate of coincidences in ordinary life. The probability of any given pattern occurring is low. The probability of some pattern occurring is high. The Jungian interpretation, which held that some synchronicities reflected an objectively meaningful structure, is not a current consensus in mainstream psychology. In contemporary conspiracy discussion, synchronicity is sometimes invoked as evidence for theories that lack other forms of evidence. The pattern is real, the interpretation. That the pattern reflects an intentional structure rather than the action of cognition on noise is the contested claim. It is included here to mark the use of psychological phenomena as substitutes for documentary support in the deepest tier of conspiracy thinking. The recursive conspiracy. At the deepest stratum of the conspiracy literature sits a self-referential structure in which the existence of skeptical critiques of conspiracy theories is itself interpreted as evidence of the conspiracy. The argument, if a powerful coordinating entity existed and wished to remain hidden, it would produce skeptics, dismissive press coverage, and apparent debunking, and the presence of these elements is therefore not counter-evidence but confirmation. The argument is structurally unfalsifiable. Any evidence against the conspiracy can be interpreted as part of the conspiracy. Any evidence in favor of the conspiracy can be interpreted as accidentally surfaced. Any silence on the matter can be interpreted as suppression. Any noise on the matter can be interpreted as distraction. The position cannot, in principle, be revised by evidence. The recursive structure is, in some philosophical analyses, including writing by Karl Popper, the marker of a closed belief system. It is included here at the bottom of the iceberg, not because the claims it generates are the most exotic, but because the structure that produces them is the most closed. The other tiers of the iceberg admit, in varying degrees of evidence-based evaluation, at the recursive bottom, the system has, by its own internal logic, exempted itself from evaluation. The unrecoverable claims. At the very bottom of the iceberg sit the claims for which the documentary record was, by intent or by accident, never assembled, and for which the relevant witnesses, sources, and physical evidence are gone. These claims may concern events that did or did not occur. They may name perpetrators or institutions that did or did not act. They may describe mechanisms that are or are not possible. The unrecoverable claims are not, by their nature, evaluable. They may be true. They may be false. They may be partially true. The mechanism by which a definitive answer could be reached has been removed by the passage of time, the destruction of relevant materials, or the strategic withholding of information by parties no longer subject to compulsion. At the bottom of the conspiracy iceberg, the deepest claims are not the most exotic. They are the most unrecoverable. The work that could have been done is no longer available to be done. The questions in the strict sense are open, and will remain open as the relevant evidence completes its passage out of existence. At the surface, you have the mainstream claims, the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing dispute, the Roswell incident, the shadow government framing. Beneath the surface, the confirmed MKUltra, Operation Northwoods, the Tuskegee study, Colorado Intel Pro, the Snowden disclosures. Beneath that, the contested Iran-Contra, the CIA, cocaine reporting the Gulf of Tonkin, the Manhattan Project secrecy. Operation Paperclip beneath that, the Unresolved, the Havana Syndrome, the UAP question, the Epstein death, the anthrax case, the COVID-19 origin. Beneath that, the Marginal, the Bohemian Grove, the Federal Reserve framing. The Smedley-Butler testimony, the Unmarked Aviation, the Phoenix Lights. Beneath that, the Esoteric, the Montauk Project, the Philadelphia Experiment, the Dulce claims, Project Bluebeam, the Babylon Working, and at the bottom, the recursive and unrecoverable, the Archon framework, the simulation as positive claim, the synchronicity as evidence position, the closed system structure, the documents that no longer exist. Between 40 and 60% of the surveyed population in major democracies believes at least one major conspiracy claim. Some of those claims have been confirmed, some have been refuted. Most occupy a middle ground that resists final adjudication. The descent through the iceberg is not in the end a guide to belief. It is a guide to the structure of the catalog, which claims rest on what kinds of evidence, and which are not valuable in the standard sense at all. The iceberg of conspiracy is not a fixed catalog. Each year, declassifications close some files, archives release some documents, and new claims emerge to occupy the space. The work of evaluating them, where evaluation is possible, is not finished.